Okay, in this video we're going to talk about a tactic on using mortars for harassing an enemy position. Now, keep in mind, if you are attacking a conventional force and you are a guerrilla, that conventional force will have fire direction radars, fire direction systems. As soon as that first round leaves your tube, they already know where you're at, and they will be locking in, returning fires. Now, I've heard that going back even to Vietnam, the enemy, well, I'll strike this, the U.S. forces, they would already have pre-plotted the likely locations that the enemy, the Viet Cong, would set up their mortar tubes at for sending in a barrage. And they would have their own mortars, their own cannons pre-laid on those positions. So the Viet Cong would come in, they drop that round down the tube, it would get detected by the fire direction or counter battery radars. The fire direction center would then tell the corresponding mortar or artillery piece, open fire. So they've determined that, okay, the fire is coming from this direction, most likely this location. Okay, who's on already pre-plotted for it? Well, that's howitzer number 2. Okay, howitzer number 2, open fire. And they start dropping in a preset number of rounds on that anticipated area. And more than likely, they were right on target. I heard a story of that happening down in the Mekong Delta. One of the units down there, they would start getting in fire. They dropped the rounds on the templated enemy fighting position where it was likely at. They went out the next morning, and then right at that location they would find that 82mm mortar tube set up with a bunch of rounds laying on the ground and a lot of tore apart dead Viet Cong laying around the tube. So how can a guerrilla get around that? Well, that was a tactic that was really easy. You constantly shift your location. So before you do this operation, you need to already have chosen what you want for your targets inside the enemy base. Already figure out the firing data from that position to hit that target. Now the target will have to be a bit larger. So let's say you're trying to hit somewhere in the ammunition dump. You have a nice wide area. It'll be easier to target. Then when you target that, you're trying to target an area where you can see is explosive ordnance, so that you're trying to set that off so it sets everything else off. If you're trying to hit something specific like one particular tent, your chances of hitting it are pretty low unless you do it with your very first shots. Now you have multiple positions already selected. You've already cleared easy access routes between the positions. So as you're running, you're not going to be running into stuff. You're not going to be tripping over stuff. When you get to that firing position, you already have it staked out, laid out. So you have the stakes on the ground where your base plate is supposed to go in between. And you have a couple other stakes setting out where the legs for your tripod or your bipod are supposed to be placed. Now, how we're going to do this here. We set up our mortars at position 1s and we wait. We pull out 2 rounds and only 2. You might have your rounds already set out on the ground at each position. 2 rounds or 1 round sitting at each position. So we're going to start here. This mortar team, once the time hits, they get the order over the radio, whatever it is. They drop 1, drop 2 rounds, grab the whole system, and they start taking off running, going to position 2. Now, as soon as those explosions go off, that's a signal for the next one, which will be over here. This team over here, they drop in their 2, and then they take off for their second position. When those 2 go off, that signals this team over here. They drop in their 2 and they took off to their second position. Well, when those 2 go off, team 1 here should already be at their second position. Their stuff is set up. And as soon as they get everything dialed in, they get their elevation and all that stuff is dialed in, they drop in their next 1 or 2 rounds, and then they take off, and then you just keep going, constantly jumping back and jumping around. Now it may be where these guys, they drop in their second one and they wait. Then they move on to their third position. They drop in their last couple rounds, and then they get the hell out of Dodge. Well, then instead of it going over to these guys, it goes over to them. Then they drop in their 2. These guys drop in their 2. Then they're at their next position, they drop in their last 2, they take off, and then these guys take off. Now, when you're shifting, you don't want to leave a pattern. You don't want to set distance, set direction. Try to change it up. Put a dog leg into it. Maybe you'll start a little bit farther out, then you'll move closer in, and then way farther out. Or here, we started closer in, we moved back, and then we shifted way off to the side. Over here, we started fairly close in, we moved a little bit farther out, and then we moved even farther out. Now, you literally can take a mortar tube up to 82 millimeter, pick it up and run with it. It's something I was told about when I did a rotation down at the Joint Readiness Training Center at Fort Polk. The observer controllers told us that the common tactic used by the opposing force, they would literally fire off 1 or 2 rounds from the mortar. Then the team, you had 2 people, they would grab the mortar itself and its bipod still attached. They would grab that, pick it up, and start running, and a third person would grab the base plate, or 2 people would grab the base plate between the 2 of them, and then they started running for their next position. When they got to their next position, they set up the mortar, they changed the adjustments off stuff that was already written up inside the whoever was in charge of that crew, inside his notebook, on his sheet, whatever he has, his little firing table. Makes the adjustments, and then they pop in their next few rounds. So this is one of those things where you don't want a fatty, you don't want a slowpoke as part of the team, because you want someone who has some strength, has some speed, because they're going to be running as fast as they can, because as soon as those first rounds go out, you're going to have incoming or return fire coming back in from the enemy. But by constantly shifting around where the fire is coming from, you're going to cause the enemy to have to decide how they're going to return fire. Are they going to have it down to just, individual artillery pieces? Are going to have to do a return fire in different directions? Or is this person so full of himself he believes everyone needs to get blown to pieces, he'll have every piece sight or go after each set of incoming rounds? Ideally, you want the fire only from the individual returning mortar or individual howitzer. You don't want the entire battery, the entire platoon. Your chances of surviving will be higher. I'm not going to say they're great, but they'll be better than if you're taking fire from multiple systems. Keep your enemy confused and annoy the hell out of them. Now, it could also be you pop in your first 6 rounds, move into your second position, the enemy's doing your return fire, And then say an hour later, you drop in the next 6 from the 3 different positions, 2 from each. And then another hour or 2 hours after that, you're dropping in the next ones. By doing that, you're keeping the enemy awake. They're constantly going to have to get up. They're going to have to go to their positions, go to the bunkers, maybe run out onto the perimeter waiting a potential attack. So you're constantly keeping them awake through the night. You're making them tired. When you select your positions for your mortars, also as much as possible, go to locations that you would not typically use, especially as a conventional force. So maybe you're going to locate them on a hillside that's not exactly very stable. Who knows? Find a spot, set it up there, use that as the firing position, move on to the next crappy location. Already have the stuff figured out, and drop your rounds in. The main objective of this is harassment of the enemy. Your goal isn't destruction of the enemy. You're trying to keep them awake, you're trying to keep them frazzled, you're trying to keep them on edge. Now, for all my engineer brothers in the Patriot and militia movements, always remember, essayons.